Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you all to today's discussion on exploring the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on international peace, security, finance, and counterterrorism efforts. And thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ilko Kessels. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Center on Cooperative Security, and it's my pleasure to open today's meeting. Before I hand over to today's moderator, Tori Holt, I want to share a few words with you. At this point in time, residents in eastern Ukraine and elsewhere have already endured 8 years of conflict. And now, 1 month into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the intensification and spread of the conflict throughout the country risk a scale of death and destruction that are extremely frightening. More than 3 million refugees, more than double that amount in IDPs, thousands of civilian casualties. The human impact of the current conflict is unimaginable. It's the largest refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War, with now a quarter of the Ukrainian population displaced. Of course, in addition to causing the immense suffering of the brave people of Ukraine and sacrificing young Russian soldiers for lies and deceit, the Russian invasion may fundamentally affect our international normative system and our peace and security architecture. From the functioning of the UN Security Council and legitimacy of organizations that Russia is a member of, to the ripple effects of sanctions, the pressures of IDP and refugee populations, and the challenge of managing the return of foreign fighters participating in the conflict. The impacts that may flow from this conflict are ever evolving and cannot be overstated. And I think it's important to note here, of course, that this is not the only conflict deserving our attention right now, and the inconsistent coverage and responses to the conflict speak to broader global injustices, racism, and gross human rights violations. It is clear that on multiple fronts, human rights, the rule of law, and human security are under assault. The Global Center on Cooperative Security works to achieve lasting security by advancing inclusive, human rights-based policies, partnerships, and practices to address the root causes of violent extremism. And this work is premised on international, multi-stakeholder cooperation, from grassroots actors that work within their communities to prevent violence, to senior UN and government officials deliberating on policies and strategies to respond to this at a national and international level. We seek to further the rule of law, to further human rights and further human security. And while, of course, our immediate thoughts are first and foremost with all those individuals affected by the Russian invasion, we're also carefully and with concern monitoring the conflict with regards to its immediate, mid, and long-term consequences. And some of these consequences include, firstly, its impact on international norms, rule of law, and accountability. Will Russia be held accountable for its actions and through what means? How does this compare to and reflect on accountability in relation to terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, for instance? And who and what protects international norms and the rule of law? We'll reflect on the consequences for multilateralism. What does this conflict tell us about the state of multilateralism, and how does it affect our international peace and security architecture? What actions do institutions need to take to remain legitimate and credible? We're considering the conflict's impact on foreign fighters. What are their profiles? What are their motivations for those joining different groups and different sides in the conflict of Ukraine? How do they and the reaction to them differ from recent foreign fighter flows to other conflicts like Syria and Iraq? And what does that tell us about government approaches? And what is the impact of the presence of these fighters, not just on the current conflict, but also in the longer term in terms of their reintegration into their countries of origin? We're looking at the consequences for the international financial system and sanctions. What has been the efficiency and the impact of the sanctions and financial actions that have been undertaken? What roles do cryptocurrency and digital assets play in evading sanctions? And what does this say about the state of our international sanctions and anti-money laundering in countering the financing of terrorism regimes? And finally, of course, we keep an eye on how this conflict worsens and affects drivers of violence. In addition to the immediate impacts of the conflict in human lives, how do other drivers of violence be affected by this conflict on the longer term? What's the effect of sanctions, the experienced trauma, and many of the other aspects of being part of this conflict on the well-being of individuals? We're joined today by a fantastic panel who will reflect on these various aspects under the guidance and moderation of Global Center board member Tori Holt, who is the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College. A couple of practical notes before turning over to Tori. Throughout the meeting, please use the Q&A function for substantive questions only. Thank you to all those who have already provided questions upon registering. We've shortlisted interventions and pre-submitted questions, but we'll also try and tackle as many questions as possible that come up in the Q&A function. So please do feel free to raise questions there throughout the event. If you experience any technical difficulties, please contact my colleague, Ms. Adele Westerhuis, directly via the chat function. Today's event is being live streamed and recorded. We also, of course, welcome you to engage with us and the panelists on social media during and after the event. Thank you for the Global Center team for the preparations for today's meeting. And it's now my pleasure to hand it over to today's moderator. Tori, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elko. It's a pleasure to join you and this esteemed panel today. I really appreciate the Global Center putting this event together. I've long admired the center's work because you combined working at the local level with grassroots activists and leadership all the way to the tops of governments in the United Nations. So I really do think the center brings a wide range of points of view together, and you understand the root causes more than many that lead to terrorism. And you have worked hard to try and link that to international human rights and efforts for peace. So in addition, your organization, like many, is presumed that there are certain rules of the road. And I think you're right to point out that we're at a time where the premise that sovereignty is important, as is territorial integrity, and that countries do not invade each other is really under assault. So I'm delighted to be here. And the question about how the Russian invasion of Ukraine, most recently a month ago, has affected the global system as well as the people of Ukraine is timely. As you noted, the human cost is pretty extraordinary. Yesterday, UNICEF marked a tough number that over half the children of Ukraine have fled their homes, roughly. We know the numbers, they almost become a bit dizzying to say 3.7 million are now refugees from Ukraine, and that roughly 6.5 million more have been internally displaced. This does not even include other countries in the region and the impact. So we'll look into that, but we'll turn also to questions about the political solutions. People are looking for off-ramps. They're looking for with hope at peace talks, but not yet seen much progress. While the Security Council remains blocked in part, or in great part, because of Russia's role there, we did see the UN vote this week to condemn Russia's actions and call out the impact on the humanitarian side. The IAEA, unfortunately, remains concerned about the safety and security of nuclear facilities in Ukraine, and there's worrying conversations about both the use of chemical weapons and those of mass destruction as a fear of escalation. But our panel today will bring, as you have noted, real interest and focus to a few key elements, including Ukraine's call for foreign fighters and what are the implications of those going to join the fight in Ukraine, both in the immediate and long term, and how does this compare to other conflicts and how we can think about the long-term consequences of that. Also with the international financial system and sanctions, it's been a pretty amazing shift to watch sanctions not come through the UN Security Council, but be put together by a coalition of nations, allies, and partners, both in sanctions and impacts on the international financial sectors aimed directly at Russia's economy, but with implications worldwide. And then, of course, multilateralism. The very nature of the system was built around trying to prevent threats to national peace and security, whether they be terrorism, conflict, war, humanitarian crises. And I think it's right to put a spotlight on where we're going next. So with that, you've already given the format. Again, just to repeat, we'll go through each speaker. We'll have a short presentation. If you've got a wonderful question, please start adding that to the Q&A function. If you've written in ahead of time, we know some of you would like to come on camera and join us. So that will happen after all of our speakers have presented. Our first speaker, let me turn to, is Kasper Reykjavik, who's a PhD and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. He is actually going to be joining us with a video message regarding the history of foreign fighters in Ukraine and the consequences given the influx there. Let us go to his remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kasper Reykjavik. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo in Norway. Thank you for having me. And as a way of introducing myself, I will just say that I've been looking at the foreign fighters, volunteers who went to Ukraine for the last 8 years, essentially. So since the beginning of this very conflict. And I just wanted to really say a few things at the beginning to kind of like, lay the ground for the discussion, and hope this actually sparks a discussion. So first of all, this mobilization for 2022, so to speak, is different than the mobilization for 2014. The 2014 one was more cohesive, more united, and per capita it featured a higher number of individuals whom we could call extremists. This is not the case now. It's a slightly different thing, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. Secondly, Ukraine speaks about a foreign legion, but there will be no one unit called foreign legion, most probably, and certainly not at this very moment. We have to realize that it is a public relations exercise also, and when it was launched at a very bad moment in the war for Ukraine. So at that very time, it looked like the last roll of the dice. So do not look for international brigades, for now at least. Look for people who will be distributed among different units to plug certain gaps, people with certain specialities or capabilities, and sometimes random foreigners assigned to a given Ukrainian unit of the territorial defense. Thirdly, do realize that these individuals are not a priority for Ukrainians. Ukraine needs weapons, Ukraine needs weapon systems. It does not need essentially the volunteers, as there are tens of thousands of, if we could say hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who are actually returning home from the work somewhere in Europe to actually fight in this war. The foreigners are a nice addition. They might help with the internationalization of this conflict. They might help with beaming a certain public relations message by Ukraine, but Ukraine will fight regardless of whether these fighters arrive. And sometimes they are very much unhappy with the fact that they're not prioritized by Ukrainians, and they will not be prioritized at all. There's a story from 2014 when, foreign volunteers felt a bit like a backpack to some of the Ukrainian troops in the field, because if you do not speak the languages, either Ukrainian or Russian, you will not be prioritized, and you will simply be assigned to a Ukrainian soldier who speaks English. And for him, that will be a bit of an issue to actually, babysit you. So in this sense, we should not be surprised that Ukrainians are not prioritizing this very issue. This is not something that with which, they go to sleep and wake up, and the first thing they're thinking about is the foreign, the wealth, so to speak, of the foreign volunteers. Secondly, however, if you persevere, and if you have good connections on the ground with some of the veterans, be it foreigners or Ukrainians, or you yourself, you're a veteran, and you are patient, you will get to the front lines and you will most probably fight. But in line with the backpack theory, again, you might not be assigned a gig that you would like to be assigned to. So, those stories about operators of some, missile launchers who are now basically, grunts, and then, in infantry, this is what you are going to get, as again, Ukrainians will not prioritize you. They will simply put you where they think they need you, and not where you would like to be put and where you would like to serve, unless you are very well connected, like some of the veterans of the special forces who apparently joined up with the Ukrainian special forces units nowadays. So but that's easier, they speak the language, they have the connections, so that was probably more easily done. Next thing, it is about veterans. It is about foreign veterans who stayed in the country in 2014, or people who fought in 2014, and they can now easily mobilize their friends and colleagues. They are basically beacons on a hill as far as recruitment is concerned. They represent certain formations, and I'll be talking about one such formation in a second, where basically these formations, they were readying themselves for this situation since 2014. They had a head start. They had a head start in recruitment of foreigners because they were waiting for them, or they tried to entice them into coming into the country from 15, 16, when the war was kind of mostly silent in a way, although it wasn't over. They struggled with this because they couldn't offer them anything, and now they can offer them almost anything. And that's why people flock to them, and that's why we should be looking for some of these units. And of course, everybody asks me about one unit, which is Azov. Everybody thinks that most of those foreign fighters actually join some kind of a nationalist militia, and they will come back and terrorize people back in their home countries. That's not the case. So far, Azov's international recruitment efforts are, let's say, mildly successful, to put the least. They're not bringing in people whom they had known from before the war. These are new people for them who are not ideologically attuned to Azov's message. They go there because they recognize a certain fighting brand, not so much an ideological brand. And of course, they will try to mold them into something useful, but it takes time. And at the very moment, this recruitment process is basically largely nowhere. You're talking 30 maybe individuals out of hundreds that crossed the border or attempted to get to Kyiv. So that angle, we shouldn't really worry about that very angle at the very moment. So these were my few points. Hope this is of use. Do enjoy the rest of the event, and I look forward to hearing from you, and then maybe catching up with you at some other venue and at some other event. Thank you. All the best.
Well, thank you very much to Casper for sharing his analysis with us. Next, I'd like to turn to Colin Clark, who is the Senior Research Fellow in the Soufan Center. He is the director, actually, of research there, where he focuses on domestic and transnational terrorism, international security, and geopolitics. He can reflect on the current flow of foreign involuntary fighters to the Ukraine, the unintended consequences of the conflict, and the challenges in managing their return. Thank you so much, Colin, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Tori, and thanks to everyone at the Global Center for this kind invitation to speak here today, and to everybody spending their time watching online. Casper is and has been close to this conflict in a way that most researchers haven't been, and so he's a friend, he's a colleague, someone I've been in close touch with over the years, studying this issue, and I think he brings a lot to the table. I'm going to talk a little bit about foreign fighters. I'm going to talk about volunteers. I'll touch upon mercenaries. I'm really going to be looking at the kind of broad swath of what we call non-state actors in this conflict, some of the unintended consequences, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing on the Russian side too, because Casper is right that far too often at least the media portrayal of what we're seeing here is very narrowly focused, and it tends to be focused on Azov because that's what gets the clicks. But there's so many other things happening in the Ukrainian ecosystem. Just talking about non-state actors. Anytime we introduce non-state actors to the battlefield, it's going to add complexity. Ukraine is no exception in that regard. It's going to be important for states to consider all of the different implications should their citizens travel to the conflict zone and upon their return. Initially, we had, members of governments in the UK, Canada, and elsewhere actually calling for their citizens to go and travel. I think they've since backtracked a little bit. They realized maybe they were being a bit overzealous and weren't thinking through some of the long-term implications. When Russian President Vladimir Putin calls for the denazification of Ukraine as the pretext behind his invasion, he's really relying on, in addition to the Russian military, he's relying heavily on mercenaries. He's relying heavily on far-right extremists, and he's relying on terrorist groups like the Russian Imperial Movement. The initial mobilization, and Casper's documented a lot of these numbers, 17,000 back in 2014, foreign fighters defined broadly. 15,000 were from Russia. So the gaslighting from the Kremlin is incredible, talking about foreign fighters going to the battlefield. 90% of them are Russian. RT has even kind of used different snippets of research from Western think tanks and then cut that part of it out where you talk about the Russian side. And so typical Russian propaganda being framed to completely ignore the Russian role in stoking all of this. And a big part of that's happened in the disinformation space. We've been tracking that quite closely, and how Russia has been stoking the flames of transnational far-right extremism. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Some scholars have made the point that individuals traveling to fight for Ukraine and enlisting in the Ukrainian armed forces should be labeled as foreign volunteers, that we should actually distinguish. So those that travel to fight alongside militias, separatist or terrorist groups should be more aptly categorized as foreign fighters. So I think, once again, we find ourselves in this kind of definitional space where we're talking about, debating what we are talking about, right? To make sure that we're talking about the same unit of analysis. And I think, foreigners to the battlefield are not all created equal. If you enlist through the embassy, the Ukrainian embassy in your country and go fight, that's a much different thing than if you're connecting with a neo-Nazi group online. and showing up on the battlefield. Those are the folks, I think, the latter that most European countries and other Western countries are concerned about. The numbers are staggering, and I think my advice on numbers would be to take them with a grain of salt. Zelensky came out and said 16,000 foreign volunteers in the first 2 weeks. We then saw Ukraine's foreign ministry share an updated figure of 20,000. But I think there's a lot of questions that remain regarding whether these numbers include members of the Ukrainian diaspora, right? And should those be counted as foreign fighters? I would argue no. If you're a Ukrainian living in the UK and you return home, are you really a foreign fighter? Or are we only talking about foreign nationals, those that are actual British citizens that are not part of the diaspora, or citizens from other European countries? So I think we're still very much parsing through the definitional phase of making sure we're comparing like with like. Because if we're going to look at prior mobilizations, we can't be lumping in diaspora fighters because we didn't do that in Syria, right? And I think, beyond just an academic exercise, it's important to be as accurate as possible when we're talking about these different categories and these different typologies. Many of the folks that we're now seeing going to fight and flock to the Ukrainian side are inspired by Zelensky. They're inspired by Ukrainian nationalism. They are inspired by what they see as defending the country against Putin and an unprovoked Russian invasion. I think, again, it's important to maintain some perspective here and to note that a very small proportion of the foreign volunteers so far are espousing far-right views. I think, that's been a major sea change from 2014 on the Ukrainian side. They've worked diligently to root that part of it out. That said, it still exists. It's still there. We need to keep that in perspective as well, but it's a smaller percentage of a larger mobilization. I think, one of the things Dan Byman has talked about before in some of his writings on foreign fighters, and he's got a great book called Road Warriors. He says that the presence of right-wing extremists should give governments pause when they consider whether to encourage their nationals to go and fight. And so anytime you're encouraging people to go to a battlefield where they may engage in violent activities, where they may witness violent activities, where they may come home with post-traumatic stress disorder and all the other things we know that comes along with deploying to a war zone, you're going to have to deal with the fallout, the second, third order consequences that come from that. You've had members here in the United States of the so-called Boogaloo movement traveling over, linking up with the Georgian Legion and others. Casper mentioned reports of foreign volunteers growing frustrated with the lack of weapons, ammunition, equipment. We're living in an age of Instagram where people want to go to conflict zones and get selfies to increase their own street cred and followers. And it's a strange place. You've got a mix of really hardcore people and some that are in way over their head. That said, governments, don't differentiate. They're going to have to care for people on all sides of that spectrum. We can get into a lot of the specifics, I think, during Q&A. Happy to talk through any of these different kind of categories, because as we know, the Wagner Group, it's another kind of non-state actor. Mercenaries, private military contractors are also in the mix. And I'd say that although the conflict, and I'll wrap up here, between Russia and Ukraine is only weeks old, it's still essential that governments begin planning now, right? They need to be proactive and not reactive and start planning for the fallout and all the related challenges that result from whatever you want to call them, foreign fighters, volunteers, mercenaries, whoever's coming back. This is an incredibly complex battlefield. There's a whole range of different violent non-state actors. They're all in the mix together, and then you've got disinformation being used to shape themes and narratives that emerge. I think beyond that, looking kind of bigger picture, Russia's poor military performance is going to have profound implications on the global order. And I think it's going to lead Putin to continue to lash out in unpredictable and in quite violent ways. Given that we've already seen war crimes committed, atrocities are mounting by the day. We're talking about a Russia that's going to remain a pariah state for the foreseeable future, which is going to remain isolated and marginalized. And we've seen in the past how the Russian state has mobilized aspects of this kind of transnational far right to include foreign fighters in carrying out some of the Kremlin's own objectives. So let me stop there and turn it back to Tori, but again, happy to kind of get into any of the aspects of the challenges here, the foreign fighter kind of picture, and whether, these differences are, I think, or distinctions, what they mean for states and for law enforcement, intelligence agencies, counterterrorism practitioners, et cetera. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Colin. It's a really important subject you've raised. And before I let you go, I thought, let me just ask 2 follow-up questions to see if you might illuminate further. So you naturally move between talking about volunteers, mercenaries, foreign fighters, but also right-wing extremists. So I think to some extent, do you see a growing either idealism or ideology that could develop in the case of Ukraine? I think you've written about this in the case of Chechnya, among other places where it shifted dramatically, and your expertise on past cases might be helpful. The second and related question might be, for many of us who don't know how this works, I'm more aware of, having worked on Syria issues in the Security Council, that there was efforts to try and reduce the financing to foreign fighters who are mainly seen as coming in a disorganized and potentially violent way on behalf of extremists. And so I don't know if any of that architecture today on the financing has a role to play in the case here in Ukraine. And if we may be in a different world where governments that may have championed limits on foreign fighters in the past may shift and say, maybe that's not so bad. But anyway, those are 2 pretty big questions, but would love you if you could animate either aspect.
Sure. Well, I think the first, and you correctly, you referenced Chechnya, where we had what was initially, a nationalist cause and a separatist cause that over time, as jihadi volunteers and foreign fighters showed up to the battlefield, changed in kind. The ideological nature of that conflict changed. It changed the level of violence, some of the atrocities that we've seen. Could that happen in Ukraine? It could. I think the important thing is we're a month in, right? Some of these conflicts drag on for years. If you look at Syria, we're now in year 11. So the things that we thought 4 weeks into the Syrian conflict, we no longer think. So much has happened between now and then. So, one of the things that I've written about, and I wrote a piece with Noreen Fink in Politico a couple of weeks ago, where we talked about the concern of Western volunteers that go and fight. They engage in combat. They see their friends and fellow volunteers killed and maimed, and they think, why didn't the West do more? Why didn't my country do more to help? Whether that is a no-fly zone, transferring MiGs, all these discussions of that we're seeing play out now, and all the kind of concern about escalation and would Vladimir Putin use nukes, right? A lot of that nuance gets lost on people that are so fired up that they're on the battlefield. They could very well return to their countries of origin with a newfound anti-government extremism. We've seen it here in the United States. After Vietnam, there was the so-called stab in the back myth, where members of the military said the government, the politicians sold us out. We could have won that war. And they actually became the vanguard of many of the far-right extremist groups here in the United States, including, neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups. So that's a concern that I have, that we could see things change and play out over time. On the financing part, it's a really interesting, and I think, unfortunately, and I was just having this conversation with Jess Davis recently, talking about kind of the landscape there. If you've got volunteers coming from Western countries to go fight on the Ukrainian side, a lot of this is going to be self-financed and self-funded, and we see these things on Telegram and other kind of social media sites where there's a kind of, just like we saw in Syria, hey, if you need to get to the battlefield or you need to get to Poland and cross into Ukraine, here are all the things you need. Here's your checklist. I think on the Russian side, it's far more interesting, because now that the Russians have been hit with massive sanctions, that's definitely going to impact a lot of what they do in this non-state actor space, whether it's through Wagner, whether it's through stoking the far-right extremism. That's the part that I'm very interested in, and I'm going to be kind of digging on over the coming weeks, particularly the Russian side. It's also, unfortunately, the side that's a lot less transparent, right? And we have a lot less visibility on what's happening there. And so it's going to take some sleuthing and some folks that are experts in this space. But, we're going to be talking about this, I think, for the coming weeks, no question.
Well, Colin, I think we've just gotten started with the depth of your knowledge. So thank you very much. And we'll be having you come back. But I'm going to turn next to an extremely well-known observer and analyst of all things multilateral and specifically around the United Nations, which is Richard Gowan. He is the UN Director at International Crisis Group, or Crisis Group as it's more known today. And in that role, he oversees Crisis Group's advocacy work at the United Nations. He liaises with diplomats and UN officials in New York, and he will speak to the implication of Russia's invasion of Ukraine for the multilateral system. I think we will force him to answer everything from the impact on norms and architecture, and also perhaps the role of the Security Council going forward. But Richard, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Tori, and thank you to the Global Center for the invitation to this really interesting event. I am going to change focus from the issue of foreign fighters to the impact of this war on the multilateral system. But I'd actually like to sort of start where Colin left off, which is to emphasize that we are really at a very early stage of understanding the implications of the Ukrainian conflict for everything that we work on. The last month has been probably the most intensive period of diplomacy in the UN and especially in the Security Council since the run-up to the Iraq War. We've had an astonishing number of meetings on Ukraine called by the US and its allies, and actually some meetings called by the Russians, who have wanted to use the UN as a platform to spread disinformation about issues like supposed US bioweapons labs in Ukraine. The Council has been meeting pretty much every other day on Ukraine, and it has produced a lot of sound, it's produced a lot of fury, and it's achieved absolutely nothing in terms of responding to the conflict for the very simple reason that Russia has a veto and has shot down resolutions condemning its actions. But at the same time, we have seen the General Assembly convene in some really quite heated diplomatic debates over the war. The Assembly has passed 2 resolutions now condemning Russia, the most recent yesterday. And if you switch attention to Geneva, the Human Rights Council has been active on the war too, mandating a commission of inquiry that will be able to track war crimes in Ukraine. Although I don't believe that that commission of inquiry has actually yet gone into action. So there's been no shortage of diplomatic activity, but once you sort of look beyond this initial rush, it's not entirely clear how the UN will be reshaped by a prolonged and presumably very deep collapse in trust between Russia and the West. One slightly surreal element of diplomacy to date has been that despite these multiple rolling arguments over Ukraine in the Security Council, the Russians and the West have managed to continue to conduct business as usual on a number of other files in New York. So since the war began, we have seen the Security Council renew the mandate for sanctions on Yemen. We have seen it renew the mandate for peacekeeping in South Sudan. And I think most importantly, we saw the Council agree a new mandate for the UN to remain in Afghanistan. Since the fall of Kabul last August, there have been big questions about whether the UN should maintain a political presence in Afghanistan. That was a subject of very difficult diplomacy between the US, Russia, China, and other players like India prior to the beginning of the Ukrainian war. We did wonder in early March whether the fallout from Ukraine would mean that that discussion of Afghanistan would fall apart, but it didn't. And in the middle of the month, the Council passed actually, I think, a rather sensible and rather good new mandate for the UN to stay on in Kabul, monitoring human rights and acting as a liaison to the Taliban. So right now, it is proving possible to keep the UN going despite Ukraine, but we don't know how long that will last. There are a number of issues on the Security Council agenda where the toxins from Ukraine are pretty likely to make it impossible to do normal diplomacy in New York. Those include discussions of humanitarian aid to Syria. The Council has to renew a mandate for cross-border aid to Syria in July. That's always been difficult with the Russians. It may now be impossible. Similarly, the Russians may have their eyes on vetoing the mandates of some peacekeeping operations run by the European Union, such as EUFOR Althea, the long-standing EU mission in Bosnia, which the Russians have never really liked. And there are at least 2 places in Africa where you have significant numbers of UN peacekeepers alongside Colin's friends in the Wagner Group. Those are the Central African Republic and Mali. And I think there's quite a high likelihood that Western powers and the Russians will really struggle to continue any sort of constructive diplomacy over places where you have UN peacekeepers and Russian mercenaries operating in the same space. So my bet is that we will see a series of blow-ups on these issues at the UN in the coming year, but I do think there will remain some areas of continued cooperation, such as over Afghanistan. And I think one important factor in that is China. China is offering Russia some support at the UN, but it's also making it pretty clear that it's not entirely happy with Russia's behavior. It's abstaining on a lot of resolutions condemning Russia in different UN forums. And we know that behind the scenes, the Chinese have been lobbying the Russians to not let their feelings over Ukraine affect their decisions on issues like Afghanistan. And I think this will also be relevant for discussions of peacekeeping in Africa, for example, because China has considerable interest in maintaining peace operations in some countries like the DRC or South Sudan going. It has troops in some of those missions. And I think the Chinese will tell the Russians not to complicate those missions too much. However, thematically, looking a bit further ahead, I think we certainly can see how this war will exacerbate existing sources of pain in UN relations. You, Tori, have mentioned sanctions. China and Russia have been on a pretty serious campaign over the last few years at the UN to delegitimize Western sanctions. They've argued that in places like Venezuela and Syria, it's actually US and EU sanctions that are hurting the population rather than the behavior of the Maduro government or the Assad government. If Russia remains under heavy sanctions, and especially if China gets hit by any sanctions related to this war, then Beijing and Moscow will continue to push this anti-sanctions narrative, and it's a popular narrative. Countries like South Africa, Indonesia, India actually buy into the narrative. So that's one area where I think we will see Russia and China maintain a sort of ideological is not quite the right word, but a conceptual offensive. And in addition to all this, looking beyond the Security Council, there is a massive crisis coming over humanitarian aid and development aid. The blunt fact is that the vast majority of ODA and humanitarian aid comes from European countries and the US. That remains the case. China is still, for example, a negligible donor to organizations like the World Food Programme. Everyone understands that the UN system relies on this Western cash to run humanitarian and development operations, and everyone understands that this cash is going to run out because money is going to be repurposed for Ukrainian refugees and for assistance in Ukraine. And so the big question that African diplomats here especially are asking is, where will the money be for refugees in countries like Tanzania or the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh? is all that money going to disappear? This is a source of extreme nervousness now around the UN system, especially given that developing countries are also looking at food price shocks and other economic destabilizing factors. So if you zoom out from the Security Council, if you zoom out even from the Ukraine war proper, I think we're going to have a huge debate about the entire UN architecture for development aid and humanitarian aid, because there's going to be a resource shock for that complete sector. And that resource shock will have diplomatic implications, because if poorer developing countries suddenly don't see Western money coming through the UN system, then they will be looking to other sources of aid. And we know what that other source of aid is. It's a big country between Central Asia and the Pacific. This is an opportunity for China actually to gain more leverage if there's a big drop in Western aid through the UN. So these are just some of the implications that I foresee, but how they play out, just as Colin said about foreign fighters, we're still only in the very foothills of understanding.
Richard, thank you very much. And your point about the humanitarian crisis, it's already at the highest levels of displacement around the world since World War II, prior to what we're seeing in Ukraine. So I think to underscore your point, that financial tension was there and it will be exacerbated. And you can imagine the implications for funding also for other efforts, whether it's global development or climate change. Let me, if I might, turn to something that you maybe touched on a bit, but could go a little further on, which is the heart of crisis groups' work in great part is trying to bring peace and political negotiations and arguing for those negotiations, even if it's uncomfortable. And you've written on this and the potential outlines. So even with the Security Council perhaps blocked from immediate action, you may be able to sense an outline of what nations are arguing about that could then lead to thinking through what negotiations that so far have not succeeded could come up with a peace agreement. So I'd like to ask you in part, where do you see a potential peace agreement heading? Do you see actors coalescing? Do you see the UN as a role in this or other actors? We've got countries that are not aligned with Russia directly, but nor did they vote for either a GA resolution or Security Council resolution, who've been discussed as candidates, and a lot of sort of capital diplomacy. And then second, years ago, and even more recently, you've been the go-to person to think about whether or not, if there was a peace agreement, any kind of peace operation, whether it's an observer mission or something stronger, which has been suggested now by the Polish foreign ministry, or at least the president, I think, which is not yet sketched out. Maybe that's the kind of instruments to be looked at. But let me just ask you broadly about that, the diplomatic options.
The sad reality is that actually New York is not a good place right now to really understand what the diplomatic options are. There are two reasons for that. The first is Security Council paralysis. Unless there are conversations happening exceptionally quietly behind the scenes, the council is being used as a platform for political theater and exchanges of accusations rather than diplomacy. And secondly, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, so far has not, as we understand it, really found an entry point to mediate in this conflict. And the main reason for that is that he's paying the price for doing the right thing. The right thing that he did was call out Russia in pretty firm terms in the first weeks of the war, describing it as a breach of international law and demanding that the war should stop. Those are demands that he repeated in a press conference this week, marking the first month of the conflict. And the Russians now hate him as a result. And the Russians have been very publicly dismissive both of Guterres, but also of some of his lieutenants, such as the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, especially when the UN doesn't go along with Russian narratives about bioweapons labs in Ukraine and so forth. So, Guterres and his team are doing the right thing of telling the truth, which is something we like UN officials to do. But because they're telling the truth, they're not being welcomed as sort of political interlocutors. In fairness, I think that more quietly, the UN is managing to talk to the Russians about humanitarian issues. There are UN officials embedded in the defense ministries in both Moscow and Kiev. They are working on aid convoys. There have now been some aid convoys run by the UN talking to the Russians. I think that's all good, although it does raise some concerns in the humanitarian sector that we're going to end up in a situation like Syria, where the Russians manipulate humanitarian aid. Looking further ahead, I think if a peace deal happens, it won't happen because of the UN. It will probably happen because Israel or Turkey or one of the other countries that we know is involved in mediation somehow manages to magic up a deal, or very frankly, the two sides exhaust themselves. And we keep on being told that Russia will be exhausted in 10 days' time. That seems to be a rolling 10 days, but there may come a point where the two sides reach a mutually hurting stalemate, and you could get a peace agreement. Now, I think that in that scenario, just to end, there might just conceivably be a 20% chance of the UN having a role in running a peace operation. Not a big UNPROFOR, I4, blue helmet military mission. That's out of the question. No one will take the risk of deploying the troops. But you could imagine a UN observer mission that went in to facilitate contacts between Russian and Ukrainian forces in terms of maintaining a ceasefire, dealing with unintended incidents of violence, checking that everyone is living up to their obligations under a ceasefire. That's actually something that I wrote about for Crisis Group yesterday. I will put the link to that piece in the chat so everyone can see it. I do think the UN could have a peacekeeping role, but that article is called A First Tentative Look at Options for a Peace Operation in Ukraine. It's the most caveated title I think I've ever used. We do understand that the key issue now is to get a peace agreement, and then the peacekeeping will follow, if it follows at all.
Yep. Well, thank you, Richard. It is one of the rules for consensual peacekeeping that there be an underlying political agreement for them to function well. And otherwise, it's peace enforcement, which rides over the often protests of either the nation or the parties to the conflict. So thank you for clarifying that. I will say, even with all the shouting in the Security Council, we know that behind the scenes, one of the benefits is that there are quieter rooms, and the shouting may continue, but it's also a place where even bilateral and multilateral arguments can be hashed out and understand what are core interests from countries. And, in contrast to Syria, the US intervention in Iraq eventually led to a place where the UN could play a role. So thank you as always for your astute observations. You always manage to be both strategic and up to the moment with what's going on. So I appreciate that. And you've well teed up our next speaker. The question of sanctions, as well as the financial policies and even the role of crypto, is something that is a very live part of this conversation. And I'm delighted to introduce Liat Chitret, who's the Director of Regulatory Affairs and Compliance Policy at Solis Labs. For over 15 years, she has led global capacity building and technical assistance programs on anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, financial inclusion, and countering violent extremism. And many of you know her former role with the Global Center. So for many, it's a welcome back. Really appreciate you joining us today, and I'd love to give you the floor.
Thanks, Tori. Hello, everyone. And thank you to the Global Center for inviting me to join this important conversation and for the center's ongoing leadership in the multilateral and global arena. It's heartbreaking and crushing what we're seeing unfold in Ukraine, and I wish for a peaceful and rapid resolution. So when sanctions against Russia were announced and first introduced, there was sort of an immediate backlash, an immediate call out and concern by regulatory agencies that cryptocurrencies will be used by Russia to evade sanctions, that they were imminently about to, provide all the access that Russia would need to coordinate its entire economy. So, Colin talked about non-state actors, and what I suggest to you this morning is that crypto assets are yet an additional non-monolithic state actor that we should be reckoning with and thinking about as another actor that we need to really be focusing on strategically as part of the problem, but also part of the solution. And I'll try and kind of make that case to you and share some perspective that I've been seeing from the crypto space. First, to say that much like cash or any other financial instrument, crypto across the variety of currencies and tokens, NFTs, can be used or be misused by any means. So it could be used for both licit and illicit purposes. And what we're really seeing in terms of a crypto bottom line is that crypto is helping both sides. It's helping Russia, it's helping Ukraine. And I'll elaborate a little bit. So when it comes specifically to the question of, is Russia able to utilize crypto for sanctions evasions, much like any other diplomatic response, the answer is yes and no. Russian entities are individually able to use crypto to evade sanctions, to move their money. However, the entire Russian economy by no means can be set upon crypto rails and crypto infrastructure. So as a country, Russia is absolutely not able to use crypto altogether to continue its economic functionalities as it needs to. But there are individual moments and instances and technical loopholes that it can utilize, whether at the entity level, at the individual level, at the oligarch level, in order to circumvent sanctions. But just very briefly, I'd like to step back and level set in terms of, when I speak of cryptocurrencies, crypto assets, or digital assets, what I'm really referring to is a form of value or currency that exists virtually, digitally, and operates on a blockchain. I'm going to skip all of the cryptographic secure transaction lingo and talk to you about the characteristics of crypto that are making this a real issue for the Russian-Ukrainian situation. First of all, we see that crypto operates as it being decentralized, and what that means, and the impact of that is that crypto crosses borders quickly. The speed is astounding. Banks take over 3 days to settle transactions. Crypto is practically instantaneous. That means that the lifeline to the Ukrainian government has been rapid and quick. We talk about crypto as also being politically decentralized, ideological free, and yet we're seeing the exact opposite situation occur, where we're seeing a war that's being crowdfunded by folks who are absolutely ideologically motivated to support, at this point in time, the Ukrainian fundraising that we're seeing. We also talk about crypto as being architecturally decentralized, which means that the computers operating in a global network don't offer a one-stop shutdown. You can't shut down the crypto operations that are ongoing. And all those characteristics make it quite favorable. Adding on to that, it's trustless characteristic. You don't have to trust anybody. You don't have to trust a bank. We've seen previous conflicts where there has been a lot of concerns about putting your trust in a central bank or putting your trust into a particular system. We've seen that, that's the reason that hawalas came about. There's a lot of when it comes to crypto, it's a network that can operate and function without trust at all. And finally, it's immutable. Crypto cannot be changed and undone. When the transactions flow, essentially, they're recorded on the blockchain and they cannot be changed or altered. Now, what this means for us is that we have significant transparency into where money on crypto blockchains have come from and where they're going. Whether they've been mined in Russia, whether they've been mined in Iran, in China, or any other countries, we see the history of crypto, and we know to interact with it based on a risk-based approach, which we know and love from the usual traditional financial system. We can assess crypto, risk score it, and provide it with its own mitigants if and when we see that crypto is coming from are wanting to be cashed out by a potentially sanctioned entity. So on the Ukrainian side, we've currently seen about $150 million that has been crowdfunded for Ukraine. It's primarily being sent to Ukraine DAO, which stands for a decentralized autonomous organization, essentially a Kickstarter campaign or a crowdfunding platform, as well as an Unchained fund, which has raised over $7 million in cryptocurrencies. We see the aid supporting refugees and also supporting the purchase of weapons. Ukraine earlier this month went ahead and legalized crypto payments as a legal tender in the country to make sure that there is legal coverage for payments to be received. Many of the crypto donations are going directly to the wallets held by the Ukrainian government, allowing it to spend and be managed under the Ministry of Digital Transformation. This is revolutionary warfare. You've got ideological crowdfunding of war. This is massive. We're seeing also that on the Russian side, the main concern is that Russia has had existing ties to crypto-linked cybercrime sites, darknet sites, the likes of Hydra, which is a darknet market for purchase of illicit goods and services, fake IDs, fake credit cards, allowing folks to circumvent know your customer rules, which could aid in potentially sanctions evasions. What we're also seeing with regards to Russia is that they do have a significant hacking and ransomware capability pre-existing this situation. They must have anticipated that sanctions will come their way. So the anticipation is to look towards an uptick in ransomware attacks from Russia. And I think on the sidelines, we've briefly mentioned China. China is watching, China is learning. There's a situation also with Taiwan that Taiwan is likewise watching and learning. We've seen China over the years hardwire itself across Africa. And this has massive implications, I would argue, a national security concern when it comes to crypto. China has already rolled out its central bank digital currency, which is essentially its digital dollar, so to speak. The US does not have one, but we've seen that the implication of this has been that many countries around the world are now fast tracking the development of their own central bank digital currency in order to tackle questions related to the dominance of the digital dollar or the dollar generally, the dominance of the dollar. The few things that I would maybe put out there is that governments right now, US, G7, G20, so on, the UN, crypto is another tool in the toolbox for governments, and it has massive applications and opportunities in the distribution of aid, in the mitigants that we discussed around the humanitarian and development aid shock that's coming. Crypto can support and help manage and mitigate a lot of these shocks that we're seeing. I think that's, if I were running a government at this point in time, I'd be investing in crypto rails to make sure that I had a plan B to, that country that we've been talking about and to provide an alternative. There's new cash and new money in there, and crypto is absolutely a foreign policy tool. What this also means is extensive public-private partnerships. We're seeing stepping up to support Ukrainian funds managements, or a variety of private crypto exchanges and crypto companies that are able to partner up very rapidly with governments in order to help make sense out of the steep learning curve that comes with crypto. But it's happening and it's working. And I think this is a really big turning point that we're seeing. I think that we also, we're seeing a testing opportunity here. I know that some entities in the UN, for example, UNICEF, are already using blockchain and are distributing small loans and small funds through crypto. And there's a real opportunity to reimagine the way that we can focus on financing. So I can talk on and on and on, but I'm going to stop right there because I know we have a great discussion upcoming, but I hope I've provided a few areas of interest for folks. And there's a lot of discussions that we can be having here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You are definitely taking us to a place where your expertise shines, because many of us are still trying to understand how this whole world of crypto and financial tools works. If you don't mind, let me draw you out on 2 points. You mentioned how this could be the first sort of crowdsourcing war or conflict, first crypto war. And you mentioned briefly that people want to send money to Ukraine, and it was going both to arms and potentially humanitarian aid. What is the governance mechanisms around that? You reeled off the name of the groups that got it, but it didn't sound like the Red Cross to me. So could you talk a little bit about, if I want to send off money through this mechanism, what are my choices? And on the other end, how we are thinking about governance, both for Ukraine, but also more internationally. And then a second quick point, there was a flurry of suddenly people trying to understand a lot more about what the SWIFT platform meant and how it worked. And I don't know if you would be able to just briefly comment on how big a deal or not that is, and if it's reversible in that if we get Richard's peace agreement, is that something that you can see countries kind of going back to so-called normal? Thank you.
Thank you. So not loaded questions at all. Let me try and tackle those. So just on the first one with regards to governance and crowdsourcing. So Zelensky has been extremely proactive in putting forward a Ukrainian vetted address on Twitter and otherwise for contributions. And so all the contributions that have been pouring in have been at the back end sort of being centralized by the Ukrainian governments, and all of the contributions are going to the Ukrainian government's wallets that are managed and dispersed by Zelensky. I think, if you look at the wallet addresses that have been posted, what's unique about them initially is that the requests for donations have been asked to be brought in by Bitcoin and Ether specifically, which are two specific coins. What's unique about both Bitcoin and Ether is that they are trackable on the blockchain. So when you talk about governance, that element of passing around $100 between all of us and not knowing where it ends up, that can't happen with Bitcoin and Ether, because at any moment, there is a capability of tracking, overseeing any movement at the tiniest amount of funds from those wallets, where they're going to, who they're being dispersed to, and that's connected pseudo-anonymously, so not fully anonymously, but you can track and see where the funds are being dispersed to and what it's being used for. And I think that governance mechanism, although hasn't been completely codified and enshrined in standard operating procedures and all of this, but that's the fundamental difference when it comes to using crypto. Just as an example, when the Twitter hack happened last year, and within 7 days, law enforcement were able to track down all of the funds that were being used and bring them back and recover those funds, because they had basically a visual map of where the money was going, even when there were attempts to obscure and blur the lines by conducting a variety of money laundering and terrorism financing kind of strategies that you can use online. But blockchain analytics companies are really aiming to give clarity to that, and that doesn't exist elsewhere. So there's a lot more that can be done and should be done around governance, but from a tech perspective, it's possible. Now we're sort of waiting for the regulatory and other folks to catch up so that we can have that governance conversation. When it comes to SWIFT, so the importance of SWIFT is really it's the global messaging system in which we wire funds and communicate globally. Unplugging Russia from SWIFT was essentially meant to give it a rapid shock of pulling away the plug from its access to global banking, correspondent banking relationships. And although there's no crystal ball or any way to predict certainty by how that would happen, crypto obviously was unable to take on any sort of amount that the Russian banks had suffered. There was no way that that crypto could step in place of SWIFT and support the potential sanctions evasions that people were talking about. What it did do, however, is to create pressure points on what we call cash out points or off-ramp points, when large crypto exchanges would need to essentially offer cash out services for people who are looking to move their money in and out of Russia or by Russian sanctioned entities. And so what we saw is that crypto exchanges who operate like money service businesses really needed to quickly strengthen up their sanctions compliance and to put in place technical escrow capabilities. So within crypto, unlike banks, there's no mechanism for you to block the receiving of money. If I send you money, your wallet has to accept it technically. So if I'm receiving sanctioned funds, I have no way to avoid it. I automatically get it, which means I'm potentially violating sanctions. The crypto workaround technically is an escrow account that a crypto exchange can say, hey, wait a minute, that's money that I have to accept, but I'm not going to use it. I'm not going to allow anybody else to cash out on these funds. I'm putting them in this escrow account. I'm reporting it as a suspicious activity to my regulator, and that money is not going to be cashed out. So what we're going to see is a growing of escrow holds within crypto exchanges and crypto businesses of those potentially sanctioned funds or that they can't move. And I think what we're going to see is pressure now on what China is going to do with its digital currency. Russia has developed its own digital currency, but we've seen its digital ruble, but we've seen that it's very introspective. It's only giving it very limited internal functionalities. It has no way to interlink externally or provide it with sort of back-end financial support. And I think, from my perspective, I don't sleep at night waiting to see what China does in terms of supporting with potential digital asset support, but that's a whole other story.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Your insights are wonderful and very, very helpful for this discussion. We've had a wonderful panel presentation, and I'm going to turn now towards our open discussion and our Q&A. Many of you have already started putting in questions in the chat function. And if you've asked to join in an intervention, look for the moderator to reach out to you directly. If I turn to you, we'll ask all of our interventions to be 2 minutes or less, please. And also, I'll ask you to introduce yourself. So again, please put your questions in the chat or do the raise hand function, and one of my colleagues will come find you. But for the moment, I see roughly 3 people in the queue who will be joining us, I think, on screen. I don't have all your full bios, but I think it's Alan Encion, Paul Brennan, and Megan Corrado. Are you with us?
I am.
Okay.
Hello, this is Alain Encion. If I'm allowed, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for providing such a very rich set of presentations by excellent speakers. I'm a little bit ashamed to appear so casually, but here in Sarajevo in the afternoon, it's quite warm. So I hope you bear with me. I had a quite general question, which I'm almost ashamed of now that I heard such very specific presentations. But the question was, what impact will the Russian aggression in Ukraine have on the neighboring Western Balkans, where nationalism, denial of genocide, historic revisionism, and border disputes are major issues, and Russia is playing a negative role? So this is more geopolitical, but I'll make use immediately of the granted 2 minutes. So I will specify that because I was triggered by the presentation also of Mr. Clark. And foreign terrorist fighters is something that I'm dealing with. I'm, by the way, the regional security coordinator for the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Western Balkans, dealing with counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. The foreign fighters, as you probably know, that have come from the Western Balkans, that have come back to the Western Balkans, are dealt with very differently. The people that come back from Syria get long jail sentences. The people who have come back from Ukraine, in both Bosnia and especially Serbia, get a platform on national television to share their heroic stories. And you see them appear now in the pro-Russian demonstrations that you see become more regular here in the region. So my question would be, do you see an additional worry or an additional threat from people that are already joining now also the pro-Russian side? And what do you think maybe of my more general question on the impact that the current aggression is having on an unstable region with a lot of sensitivities? Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Those are actually fantastic questions. I'm going to turn to one more person. If Megan is with us, I understand your hand is up. And then we'll either take one more or I'll go to the panel. Megan, can you hear me? All right. We had one other person requesting to join in. I don't know if Paul, you can hear me and you'd like to ask your question of the panel. All right. Well, why don't we sort out who wants to ask questions? But I think Alan has posed 2 very meaty conversations, and I'd like to, if we could, go back to the full panel, but particularly maybe kick off either Richard or Colin. Colin, I think the foreign fighter question was a bit headed your way, and Richard, maybe that gives you a moment to think about the larger consequences. But Colin, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, I would, and I think it's an excellent question, and certainly nothing to be ashamed about of asking. I mean, these are very poignant questions. Look, anytime you have conflict, there's going to be destabilizing effects. There's going to be second and third order impacts that we're not prepared for. I'll tell you what caught my eye was a piece in The Guardian maybe a couple of weeks ago by Chris Chibis, who I used to work with at the RAND Corporation. Chris was then the National Intelligence Officer for Europe, and so really knows these issues in and out. One thing that he mused about openly was, if this conflict drags on, will the Russians send, either Wagner folks, other extremists into Europe to conduct sabotage operations and terrorist attacks on European soil? They haven't shied away from assassinating dissidents in the UK and Germany. And so I don't think this would be beyond the pale at all for Russia. And I think we could end up seeing some really destabilizing effects if you have attacks in, the south of France or Berlin or, other places. That would be a game changer, in my opinion. The other thing that Putin is doing is he's using refugees as a weapon. I mean, he's deliberately sending in floods of refugees and displacing people internally within Ukraine, because he knows that Western nations are going to have to deal with that fallout. And so the more we're focused our time, energy, and resources on dealing with the humanitarian aspects, the less we'll have to focus on the conflict. I mean, that's just, the fact of the matter. So I think, and then as you mentioned, Elaine, you're still dealing with the fallout in the Western Balkans from mobilizations that took place years ago. It's going to be the same thing with this conflict. These issues don't go away. Governments often adopt the kick the can down the road approach, unfortunately, because they are very complex problems that require intensive resourcing. And so they do lead to these kind of second order impacts that, as you rightly well know, you're dealing with it from a policy level. And so a whole bunch of things that I think we're not expecting that are going to result, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Colin. That's extremely helpful. Richard, may I turn to you next?
Yeah, so I mean, I touched on this very briefly in my initial remarks, but there is a UN dimension to this, because as I'm sure you will recall, sitting in Sarajevo, there was a bit of a crisis last fall when Russia threatened to veto the continuation of the mandate for EUFOR Althea in Bosnia, primarily because of a dispute with the West over the office of the High Representative. And again, sitting in Sarajevo, you know the backstory to this, but Russia and actually China have basically turned against OHR and see it as a Western tool. Now, last fall, it was possible to avoid the Russian veto of EUFOR Althea, but I think if we look at sort of the list of potential flashpoints in the Security Council that will be affected by what's going on in Ukraine, the renewal of that mandate is one of the most vulnerable points. And so you could well imagine, assuming this crisis is dragging on, even if hopefully the active hostilities are over by the second half of this year, that Russia would announce that it would veto EUFOR on principle. It might also veto, by the way, the continuing mandate for Operation Irini, which is the EU naval mission off the coast of Libya. Now, some friends at the European Council on Foreign Relations wrote a good piece about this. I'm putting it in the chat. It's called Council of War, and it looks at Russia's potential vetoes over Bosnia and Syria. They point out that if you read the Dayton agreements, there probably is a legal case for maintaining some sort of NATO or EU force in Bosnia, even without a Security Council mandate. But clearly, if you had a situation where Russia refused to support the force in the Security Council, and Western countries attempted to keep the peacekeepers in place, that could well have serious repercussions in terms of dealings with Republika Srpska and also potentially with Belgrade. So exactly how this will play out, we're not sure, but I do worry that Russia has a very clear pathway to causing trouble for you and your colleagues in Bosnia through the Security Council. But the only good news is that that mandate isn't up for renewal until November, and you know, a lot is going to happen between now and then.
Fantastic. Alan, thank you very much. I think your question really did spark some additional insights and some really good points. So thank you. I want to turn to someone else from our audience. I see Atena Makona. I mispronounced your name. I apologize. Welcome to the discussion. Over to you to introduce yourself and to pose your comment question.
Thank you very much. Actually, I really enjoyed the conversation.
I'm sorry, we've lost you briefly.
The narratives from a long time. I just want to, by the way, my name is Ahmed. Yes. By the way, I am anti-money laundering consultant in East Africa. Just to introduce myself, I have some 3 questions. They're all related. Especially, I want to mention to Mr. Richard. My first question is that the current conflict, the current invasion of Russia on Ukraine, do you think that it's going to change the world norm? Do you think that it's going to make UN irrelevant and encourage some big countries to undertake invasion on smaller countries in the context of national security? For example, China against Taiwan or Hong Kong, you know, Egypt against Ethiopia. You know, we have conflict on the Nile River, Egypt. So do you think this will change? That's my first question. The second one is, do you think the US policy against between Ukraine and Russia? I mean, for me, the Cold War was never over. We see a very hateful exchanges between the US and Russia over time. We saw a very pit-pat for a long time. And I mean, does this make Russia insecure? I mean, do you think that the US should change the policy? It's a nuclear power country. And do you think the US policy contributed? My final question is that, I mean, the Ukraine resistance, it's very incredible. We try to follow up the news on the Sky News and other issues. Very, very incredible. So what do you think will be the outcome? I mean, I don't think that Russia at any cost wants to win this war, right? And do you think more destruction on Ukraine? Do you think there will be nuclear conflict and third world war? What do you see of the future in this area? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Those are 3 very important and very large questions. I'm going to turn to Liat in a moment here. I don't expect every panel member to answer all 3, but I will give you the chance to answer which ones you like. Over to you first, but then Richard and Colin, I will turn to you next.
Tori, I had trouble hearing the question.
Why don't I repeat the questions?
Thank you.
So,
sorry.
for all of us, if I hope I got this correctly, but first, given the tensions around this conflict, could we see a renewal of tensions in other areas where the UN is not able to step in? I think in a way he was asking, is the UN irrelevant? And noted, say, the tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia, for example, or China and Taiwan. I may not have gotten all those examples exact, but the idea of the tensions rising in the UN no longer sort of playing a moderating role. And second, what is, is Russia's interests here? If I got that correctly, where does this go, and how is this resolved? That might be a question actually for you as well, the pullback question. And then, do they want to win, and what are the repercussions? I'm sorry if I didn't get all three of your questions correctly, but I think you were asking the three biggest questions we have really about this conflict.
I'll make a brief contribution to this, which is to say that if the UN does not innovate, in my perspective, if we do not embrace the ways in which technology can help us do peacekeeping better, could help us do financing, aid disbursement, development, humanitarian, refugee support, all the things that are bread and butter UN elements. If we don't innovate around that and find better ways to tackle endemic corruption, siphoning of aid funds, we're just going to end up with Syria 2 and any other sort of scenario that we've seen before. And we really have an opportunity to work with a robust private sector that really wants to help. There's cash being poured in all over the place, from venture capitalist funds onwards to crypto businesses that really are also looking for opportunities for social corporate responsibility and support, for partnerships and so on. So I think there's a really important opportunity for the UN to innovate. I'll spare you my opinion on what I think Putin is trying to do. I don't think I'm an expert by any means. It would just be my personal opinion. So I'm going to skip that one, Antenna, but great to see you. And I'll turn over to others.
All right. Well, thank you. I think it's tantalizing enough to hear a slightly optimistic note that if the UN can sort of take advantage of the moment and modernize, it might have some additional tools that it could make use of. Colin, would you like to come next?
Yeah, I'll just weigh in very briefly because you're right, Tori. These are big questions that probably deserve their own webinar, altogether. I think in my take, and again, I'm not a Russia expert. I don't want to pass myself off as one, but I've been following this issue closely. I think Putin felt emboldened by previous incursions, and he thought that Ukraine was going to look a lot like Georgia in 2008, which was essentially a 2-week military invasion, in and out, achieving their objectives with a slap on the wrist from the international community. He gambled and he lost in terms of, and Lavrov has admitted it much. They were not expecting these full-throated, unified Western sanctions and to be as comprehensive. Look at Germany. Germany, shelved Nord Stream 2 and then committed 100 billion with a B euros to spend on defense by the end of the year. So, this invasion backfired in almost every way possible. The Russians are losing massive numbers of troops, as many as 10,000, if not more, totally demoralizing. They've exposed themselves as a second-rate military. This is not the great power that many have talked about. I think it's a gas station with nukes. The Russians don't deserve to be in the great power conversation. They're not a great power. And then I think there was a question there, would Putin use nukes? The fact that we're even having this conversation is chilling. And I think, there are great experts out there like Fiona Hill, who had an interview in Politico where she said, yeah, I think he would. If backed into a corner with no other options, I think he would resort to nuclear weapons. So I'll defer to experts like Fiona Hill. But again, just the fact that we're having these conversations and they're serious tells you everything you need to know about what the Russians have done under Putin. This has been a debacle in every sense.
Thanks very much, Colin. That's helpful. Richard, do you want to join in on this part of the discussion?
Sure. So three points. I think the first question, it wasn't just about sort of the UN as an organization Although I would say that I actually think that UN institutional reform probably gets harder, frankly, now, that rather than easier. But it was also around sort of the basic norms of the UN Charter, because this is a pretty rare thing by post-war standards, which is a classic interstate war. Not an internationalized civil war, not some sort of funky hybrid operation, but a classic one country invades another sort of thing. And for most of our professional lives, the last 30 years, interstate war has been incredibly rare. We did see Nagorno-Karabakh in, I guess, late 2020. And I think the guys who do conflict data at Uppsala pointed out that that raised the number of interstate wars in the world to 2, which was a record for the post-Cold War era. They have been incredibly rare. Will we now see a return to interstate war as a normal policy tool? And there are some disturbing signs, specifically in Nagorno-Karabakh. The Russian peacekeepers there are obviously rather distracted, and it does look like Azerbaijan and Armenia are testing each other again. So we could actually have another war in the post-Soviet space kicking off. This is something my colleagues in the Caucasus have been flagging in the last couple of days. More generally, I simply think it's too early to predict. I don't think the chances of Ethiopia and Egypt going to war over the Ethiopian dam project sort of are massively increased or decreased by what's going on in Ukraine. But it certainly means that international diplomatic attention to what's going on between Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt is reduced. And that means that if there were steps, miscalculations or deliberate calculations towards war in East Africa, then Washington would not be seized of that, I think, in quite the same way that it was seized of the situation in Ethiopia with Tigray last year. So it does, when you're distracted by one major sort of conflict, clearly you're going to sort of have less of a focus on others. In terms of Russia's security perceptions, I think it was difficult to hear you, but I think you were saying, did NATO expansion create a sense of insecurity in Russia? And I think the answer to that is obviously yes. And that wasn't just in Mr. Putin's head. But the point I would make is that in January this year, the US and its allies offered Russia a genuine security dialogue about European security. Now, with a lot of red lines, but nonetheless in a way that the West hadn't been willing to talk to Russia for quite a long time. And if Mr. Putin had been solely concerned with attempting to redesign the OSCE and other aspects of the security architecture in Europe, he could have taken that dialogue and he could have entered a diplomatic process that would have delivered, probably some of what he wanted. Instead, he invaded Ukraine. And if you listen to his speeches when he was in the first stage of the invasion, this was not a man who was primarily concerned with the OSCE reform. This was or the return of the Conventional Forces in Europe treaty. Something much more deep and primal in his view of Ukraine was driving him on. Although, as Colin said, I think he also just expected a quick win. Lastly, are we all going to die? This is a good question. I find it quite interesting. I would say, well, firstly, yes, but I guess are we all going to die in sort of roughly the same couple of hours? Look, I think that I agree with Colin. We should be very concerned that this is a conversation at all. I think the sort of nuclear theologists have differing views over how serious the threat is at the present time. But what I would say is that what we should take away from the fact that this is a threat at all is that, yeah, pressure is great. And that the level of pressure on Putin is remarkable. but we do also have to think about frameworks for de-escalation. And thinking about frameworks for de-escalation involves diplomacy. It might, as we said, involve peacekeeping. It will have to involve some sort of compromises around Crimea and so forth. It is possible to both apply pressure and talk about de-escalation at the same time. I am a little worried that at the moment, everyone in Brussels and Washington and so forth is sort of high on just piling more pressure on Russia. But we do still have to talk about the frameworks for de-escalation in parallel with that, because otherwise, in a best case scenario, this just turns into a longer war in which a lot of Ukrainians die. And that's something that we just want to stop.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you for also repeating what you heard our questioner ask. And I think there was some nuance there. It was good to have you capture. And I will also note your point, which is maybe the council's blocked, but the ferociousness of the response, in a way you were framing it around the norms, matters. It is for many of us in our professional lives, one of the very rare times when one country has invaded another. And personal observation for me is just with Russia sitting on the Security Council, they had every tool available to them if they really felt that either there was development of a nuclear capability or abuse of a Russian-speaking population or a disagreement over a border peace. And to not make use fully of all those mechanisms is also a bit stunning. All right, I'm excited. We're going to turn now to two more interventions. And I'll ask both Anna and then Tracy to briefly introduce themselves and pose their question to the panel. Anna, you're up first, please. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Oosterlink, and I am head of UN at Article 19, which is a global human rights organization defending free speech. Thank you so much for organizing this timely discussion, and it's been very interesting. I have a question for Richard, but possibly also other panelists. So I don't want to discriminate in that sense, but I think he will have some thoughts. There have been discussions to evict Russia from certain multilateral fora, including the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council. And for example, my own organization called for Russia's suspension from its elected membership of the Human Rights Council, because we felt it's really hard to rhyme aggression, this type of aggression, and the commission of war crimes with sitting on and voting in the main human rights body within the UN. However, there are other international experts, including the Special Rapporteur on protecting human rights while countering terrorism, that argue that this will risk turning Russia into even more of a pariah state and will decrease opportunities for the very needed diplomatic engagement, in particular considering we are dealing with a nuclear power. And these are my words, a potentially unhinged leader. Do you think eviction is advised? And then would that be from the Security Council, or are you thinking other fora such as the Human Rights Council? How would that impact the solution for peace in Ukraine, or the seeking for a solution for peace in Ukraine in particular? And then maybe also some of these more broader questions that you mentioned, which I thought was very interesting, the potential spillover in terms of peacekeeping operations and other discussions on the agenda. And then I had one final specific question, picking up on what was said on UN reform and how it's become harder. And a particular question on Security Council reform. Is there any point in pursuing the reform of veto power? I know that some have been suggesting that obviously Russia has been abusing that in terms of deflecting and defending their own position. But I'm wondering if even the other P5 would be open to any thoughts of reform of the veto power. I'm just going to focus on that particular one, but bigger Security Council reform in terms of membership, any thoughts there are welcome as well. And just to thank you all, the Global Center, for organizing, and looking forward to engaging with all of you in the next few months on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Those are very thoughtful questions. Appreciate you posing them. Before I turn back to the panel, though, I'd like to go to Tracy. Tracy, if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Tracy Derner. I'm Director of Financial Integrity and Inclusion at the Global Center. I wanted to pick up on something that Leah mentioned about, well, two things really. Firstly, about how kind of the crypto ecosystem was not quite ready to fully absorb the full force of the Russian economy, and therefore didn't really undercut sanctions measures quite as widespread as some had been concerned, although of course that was different a bit at the individual level. So my question is that a matter of the crypto ecosystem not being ready yet? And if so, what does that mean for the future of sanctions measures and kind of other multilateral efforts to use financial tools as a foreign policy tool? Particularly noting some of the opportunities you mentioned about the transparency in the blockchain system. And then my second kind of question is, I was really struck by kind of the huge positive force that crypto has been for Ukraine, and the point that you made about this being a revolutionary, almost kind of crowdsourced war. What can and maybe is already being done to consider what a more robust crypto ecosystem would mean for that type of crowdsourced war in the future? So kind of, in other words, what should we be thinking about now with an eye towards the next crypto war and what that might look like? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I may go first to Richard for the questions around the different UN bodies and the role of Russia on and off, and also the use of the veto. And then Leah, if you don't mind, I'll turn to you on our last question. And Colin, happy to also get your opinions as a third speaker here. But Richard, over to you.
Okay, I mean, ways to penalize Russia. I think we've all been penalized because we've had to read the bits of the UN Charter we always ignored before to find the answers to this. But here we go. Can you throw Russia out of the UN or out of the Security Council? No. The reason for that is that Article 5 of the Charter allows for the suspension of countries. Article 6 allows for the expulsion of countries from the UN. But in both cases, that has to be on the recommendation of the Security Council. And there is one precedent from, I think, the 70s, when there was an effort to throw apartheid South Africa off the Security Council, but it was blocked by P5 vetoes. The precedent is the recommendation of the Security Council on membership is a substantive issue where the veto applies. Russia has a veto, so it can stop itself being thrown out of the UN. And it's, it is said that actually that is quite deliberate. Russia was expelled from the League of Nations for the invasion of Finland. And so when the UN Charter was being negotiated, the Russians were very keen to ensure that they would not be thrown out by the Americans at some future date. So those forms of expulsion are not possible. 2, there is a theory espoused by Ukraine that Russia did not legitimately inherit the Soviet seat at the UN at the end of the Soviet Union. And because the UN Charter refers to the USSR being a permanent member of the Council, not Russia, Ukraine has argued that it should at least be denied its seat at the horseshoe table. This again just doesn't work. Ukraine was one of a number of countries that signed a statement in, I think, 91, a number of post-Soviet states, recognizing that Russia was the successor state at the UN to the Soviet Union. And also 30 years of diplomatic practice does actually matter. And Russia has been consistently recognized as being the holder of the seat. Frankly, I think throwing Russia out of the Security Council would also be highly satisfying, but politically unwise. I think the idea of pushing revisionist states out of multilateral organizations is probably more dangerous than useful, because once they're on the outside, there's even less restraint on how they behave. The idea of expulsion from the Human Rights Council or suspension from the Human Rights Council, though, I think is interesting. And I think after yesterday's General Assembly vote, where you had a clear 2/3 of countries again supporting Ukraine and condemning Russia, you will now see a push to action the mechanisms for suspension from the Human Rights Council, which, as you know, requires a 2/3 majority of countries in the Human Rights Council and in the General Assembly voting for suspension. I think this is a feasible diplomatic slap at Russia. but I would still be a little careful about supposing that all the countries that have signed on to the resolutions we've seen so far would actually back this more concrete step against the Russians. And it's worth remembering that for a lot of countries, this creates some precedents. You know, if you can suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council, you know, who's going to be next in line for suspension? This does raise a level of concern that more general condemnations do not raise. And I also think it's important to say that you would need a really solid majority for this, just in political terms. I have heard some people say, well, you know, a lot of countries would abstain. The abstentions don't actually count when you're counting the votes. So, you know, maybe we could get away with it. You need a big real majority of countries to make this politically feasible. And on that last note, I would say that all the penalizing discussions are fun and important, but they have to be paralleled with efforts to actually maintain a positive coalition of support for Ukraine at the UN. And so I think the next step that the West should take is actually to table a General Assembly resolution talking about the global effects of this war. And I think actually it would be great if Ukraine would table a global resolution about the need for an international response to the food price shocks that are coming. Because there is already a narrative here that there are going to be food price shocks because of Western sanctions on Russia. And therefore it's actually the West that is at fault. No, there's going to be food price shocks because Russia invaded Ukraine, and it's jolly hard for Ukraine to export its wheat when its railway lines are being bombed. And I think that Ukraine needs to sort of tell the rest of the world that actually it's Putin's war and it's Putin's food price shock. And I think you need to have some of that narrative to keep the global community on side, because otherwise you will start to see the 140 countries that backed Ukraine yesterday begin to fray.
Very useful. Thank you, Richard, for your direct answering of a number of really tough questions. That's good. Leah, can I turn to you next? I think you also have some really fantastic questions aimed at you.
Yeah, terrific questions. Thanks to Tracy for thinking of them and posing them. Appreciate that. So on the first one, on the crypto ecosystem, you know, we're always talking about crypto being in its infancy, and you know, the Bitcoin Satoshi white paper kind of appeared on the scenes in 2008. And we've been arguing that, you know, crypto is speeding to the moon at the speed of light, and everybody's always talking about going to the moon, where there's a lot happening here. And so while crypto wasn't able to absorb the Russian economy at this point in time, I think there's a fundamental learning that we really have to grapple with, and that is that governments have no choice but to wrap their minds around crypto and have clear policies and enforcement capabilities and regulations at this point in time. This cyber crypto warfare theater situation has really taken center stage, and it's a watershed moment for crypto, and there's recognition of that. And yet you see that governments are still in the position of, you know, banning crypto, not wanting to talk about it, not wanting to think about it, avoiding it. There's a massive need to reassess that right now. And there needs to be a whole of government approach to blockchain technology, what the implications of it are. There's tremendous resources poured into it. And there's implications to ideological crowdfunding. You know, at this point in time, we can say that it's supporting Ukraine tremendously, but what happens when crowdfunding begins to fund ideological warfare and other kinds of forays? And we've seen, you know, the likes of that and inklings of that with ISIL and other parts around the globe. So I think we always talk about, you know, when we speak about terrorism and things like this, is you need the means and the resources as well as the ideology. And what you're seeing now is an absolute decentralized capability of providing means to a variety of causes. I would emphasize that crypto businesses and governments are now not flying blind. There's you know, a stronger toolbox to deal with. It's a matter of how do we handle them. One of the things that I'm eyeing in the future and I'm concerned about is the development of privacy enhanced technologies and the governance frameworks around them. You know, we do see that there are perfectly legitimate use cases for technologies that anonymize funding sources, but what do we do with that when it comes to enforcing sanctions regimes, or when it comes to other areas of of governance. I think that's very important. I do see that there's a bit of a balance of power tipping. We're seeing, I'll get very nitty gritty and detailed, but practically speaking, I'm personally observing a brain drain from governments into the private sector, folks that have been working for years on financial institutional policies, on a variety of compliance matters, regulatory frameworks, and so on, that are coming over to tech companies. And that's going to have implications to the workforce, the talent knowledge. I think we should be investing more in financial literacy and what that means. Specifically on Ukraine, there's a massive Ukrainian technology talent. Many technology companies have Ukrainian teams that support them. When we think about refugee resettlements, I think there's an opportunity there to maximize on the creation of jobs that are really tech jobs that don't need to be hinged to a particular geographic location. So I think crypto as an ecosystem, as an industry, offers a variety of ways in which the industry can support job creation, refugee resettlement, and practically governance mechanisms and structures. But it really, really requires governments to buckle into the discussion, educate themselves on what it is that the technology does, what is its risks, its opportunities and limitations, and get down to business, because there's a lot happening here that governments have to play catch up on. And it's a massively well-resourced industry that deserves to have kind of a government partner. I think it speaks volumes for the opportunities for public-private partnerships. And I think, Tracy kind of pitched me two questions that put me up on a pedestal, and I can ramp on for hours. So I'm just going to stop there. But really, I do want to emphasize the silver lining of what is a really dire situation and the opportunities that we have to build at this time.
All right. Well, thank you. I have one more. Thank you very much. I have one more written question, which I'm going to pose to Colin. And then I will do sort of a final quick round with each of you, and I'll give you a head start. So Colin, and on the final round, I will say it again, but I'd love you to have, if there's one or two major thoughts or recommendations for the community that's listening in, I'll pose the question to you. So, but Colin, we've got a question from Felix Lapointe from Global Affairs Canada that you may be able to address. And Colin writes, considering the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine are global, how will this affect the recruitment of people within terrorist and extremist groups? Will there be a rise of associates of extremist groups on that global level? So it's a pretty broad question, but I thought you might have some observations that would be helpful for Felix.
Well, I'll say two things, and I think there's going to be an impact on both what we call here in the United States REMV, which is racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. But let's also not forget about jihadist groups. There's going to be an impact there as well, and I'll tell you how. First on REMV, right now you've got Russia fighting for what it views as an existential conflict in Ukraine. So it's pulling out all the stops. It's pulling back Wagner mercenaries. We've had conversations with entities in the U.S. government that said as much as 90% of Wagner resources are being pulled back to Ukraine. If that's true, that's actually going to impact the jihadi space, because if you think about places where the Russians are operating, even though they're known to abuse human rights, there is some kind of security footprint, for better or worse, and oftentimes worse, in these areas. So when you go from a security footprint to a power vacuum, that essentially allows some of these groups to kind of gain leverage. That's happening at the same time. We've got this shift here in the United States and the West of this, we're done with the global war on terrorism. We don't want to talk about it anymore. We did 2 decades. It's all about great power competition. So let's forget about the Sahel. Let's forget about the Horn of Africa, Southeast Asia. It's all about, China, Russia, et cetera. The pendulum has swung from non-states to states. And too often we look at these issues as binary. It should be both, right? We should be concerned about states and non-state actors. We should be concerned about great power competition and counterterrorism. In fact, you can't talk about great power competition without talking about counterterrorism. I'm having flashbacks to this summer with Afghanistan and the either or nature of these debates, which I thought was wrong-headed. The boost for REMV movements is going to be that the Russians are simply catalyzing and galvanizing those movements right now. We wrote a piece in War on the Rocks last week, myself and several of my colleagues at the Soufan Center, where we essentially talked about how Western fanboys of Russia are reacting online. And I can tell you the way they're seeing this conflict is much different than the way we're here talking about it today. They see this as a war for civilization and the white race, and they look at Putin as representative of that, as the last best chance for white Christendom to survive. And so that may very well result in some impacts in Europe with groups like the Nordic Resistance Movement in Scandinavia and elsewhere. The neo-Nazi white supremacist network is strong and very, very well may be motivated to act on the heels of what we're seeing happening now in Ukraine. So a lot of implications for terrorism and counterterrorism.
Colin, that's extremely helpful. Thank you very much. I appreciate one of your last points about it's either, we're swinging the pendulum, swinging from non-state actors to great powers. And I'll say one thing from this conversation that I would observe is that violence in any kind of conflict is often aimed at civilians. And we have to shift from treating it as something that is a consequence of the war to sometimes a tactical and operational strategic aim of a conflict to, as we're seeing in Ukraine. So I think that you probably are very knowledgeable about that because that's what non-state actors have been often accused of doing. We now see a state that's doing it. All right, I'm going to do a lightning round for all of us to give each of our speakers a final chance to make a final recommendation or observation. And then I have to hand it back to our hosts. So I've heard a lot today about governance, the structures of the international system, and both optimism and pessimism. But I think where you all seem to trend is that if the international system can both hang on to its interests and values, but not be static in the way it functions, and not have the international community be too reactionary, like all in or all out, that we have a future that may actually work. Because all of you have pointed out that this is not a popular war with the international community. And while not everybody is voting for every General Assembly or Security Council resolution, there are very few allies of what Russia's doing. So just to set that up, why don't I go first to Richard, then I'll turn to Colin and Leah to finish us off, and then I will finalize.
So will the international system survive?
And you're allowed to give us a recommendation, Richard, of any point you want to make.
So look, all I would say is that anyone who has been surprised that the UN response to this war has been a bit of a mess hasn't been following the UN very closely in recent years, because the UN's response to the coup in Myanmar was a mess. The UN's response to the war in Ethiopia was a mess. I could go on. I think we have to be really honest that the decline of the Security Council as a major actor in international peace and security has been quite a long process. And this accelerates it. Although, as I said at the start, I don't think the Security Council is altogether dead. I think what I see in this moment, though, is actually an opportunity for the UN and those countries that care about the UN really to show how the organization can respond to the global dimensions of this crisis, starting with refugees pouring into Poland and Moldova, and then going on to managing the food price shocks, the economic shocks, and other risks that are spinning out from the war in Ukraine. Because even if the council is dead, even if peacekeeping is only going to ever be a tiny part of the answer to this conflict, if at all, the UN still has enormous tools and enormous convening power to manage some of the non-military, non-security dimensions of the global crisis that's emerging. And my recommendation, and I think this is what Guterres is doing, in part because he cannot really engage diplomatically in Ukraine, is for the UN to look at those issues. Because otherwise you're going to get a whole range of cascading unintended consequences. Riots in response to food prices, toppling weak states, and so on. That will just make this all worse.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Colin.
Yeah, I would just, I want to kind of go back and end on something that Richard had mentioned earlier, which was the need to provide off-ramps. A lot of the discussion I'm seeing now And look, it's impossible not to be rooting for Ukraine, at least in my opinion, right? I mean, this is a small country that was attacked by a bigger country. Well, not a small country, but certainly attacked by a much bigger country, unprovoked, and its people are fighting valiantly. I mean, the bravery and the courage that we're seeing, and I don't know, I mean, maybe I'm just a victim of Ukrainian information operations, which are also pretty spectacular, I might add. But look, this is a country fighting for the very ideals that many in the West take for granted. It's hard for me not to look at what happened on January 6th in my country and look at Ukraine and think, wow, the very things that we hold dear and definitely take for granted, these people are giving their lives for. So I think that's a segue to say that as Richard mentioned, we have to provide off-ramps, right? It doesn't seem fair, right, that the Ukrainians should have to give up anything or should have to concede at all. But that's the world we live in. And I think stopping the carnage is the first priority, and then figuring out from there. Richard's also right that it's fun to talk about the punitive stuff, right? And what we should be doing to make Russia pay and to punish Putin for his ill-fated adventure. But at the same time, we need to do that in the parameters of keeping the unity and maintaining the unity of Western and NATO countries, which I think is, at a fairly unprecedented level in terms of singing from the same sheet of music. And how do you kind of sustain that momentum, right, in a way that brings positive change? And then lastly, I just think we need to be a little bit concerned, and this is an unpopular opinion in some quarters, of being overly punitive on the Russians and pushing them to a place where they can't come back from, because then you're backing Putin into a corner. Then I think those conversations about tactical nukes become even more real. But Nick Miller, who's a professor at Dartmouth, said this on Twitter of all places, and I've been thinking about it almost every day. He said, what we're doing right now is an experiment, because never in world history before have we strangled the economy of a nuclear armed country that's headed by a dictator who's been in 2 years of COVID isolation. This is all happening before our eyes, and it's not a game. So I think we need to think really long and hard about what the potential implications are. And as unpalatable as it may be to do a deal with the Russians, we've got to stop the violence, we've got to stop the bloodshed, and then we can figure out the rest from there. But to me, from a humanitarian perspective, that's the number one priority right now as I see it. And we need to do that in a way that maintains cohesion and actually gets the Russians to stop killing civilians.
Yep. Thank you very much, Colin. Leah.
Yeah, Richard and Colin have said it absolutely to a T. I agree absolutely 100% with everything that's been said. The one piece I would add, or two pieces actually, is that there's a massive misinformation and propaganda campaign ongoing, and that has significant implications in terms of the decision making and where ideologically people align and so on. And I think that with social media platforms and so on, this is something that's going to continue to be, again, a fundamentally important part of the conflict de-escalation and resolution, but also of rebuilding and so on. One of the key things that I'd like to propose and leave you with is that we will continue to see a convergence of typologies between traditional finance and crypto assets. So we'll be seeing more and more nexus points where crypto and banking are coming together, and that requires a significant amount of knowledge, attention, and governance. So governments need to be prepared to talk about decentralized autonomous organizations, about DAOs. Governments need to understand non-fungible tokens and what that means. Governments need to know what decentralized finance is all about. And that's a steep learning curve. So I'd really love for us to get moving faster on the innovation pieces, because we're already seeing right now with Ukraine the concerns over women who are being trafficked into rings as they're leaving Ukraine, and we know that crypto is sometimes used in many of these human networking or human smuggling networks. So there's a clear need to address those hybrid intervention points where traditional finance and innovative finance come together, and I'll just leave that point there.
Thank you very much. Well, I think you've all done a masterful job of both focusing on the immediate need to bring an end to this conflict and war in Ukraine and the human costs that we're seeing and the need for diplomatic, solutions. And I would look forward to the next conversation where we then talk about how to implement all that. But in also doing so, each of you have highlighted major challenges and opportunities in the international system that are both critical of what we're facing, but also forward-looking. And for that, I want to thank you. And thank you for spending the time with us today. To those of you who wanted to get a question in, I'm sorry we had more than we could get to, and I apologize for that. But I'm very excited to say that we will be posting this as a recording on the Global Center's website. If you're interested, get in touch or check the website out in a little while. And I also want to thank the Global Center for putting one excellent panel together, inviting me to join you in conversation today. It's important work, and we will keep the conversation going. So thank you again, and thank you all for joining us. I'm now bringing this meeting to a close. We'll see you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.